All right, Bill Williams, if you'd please come up, and we'd like to have you introduce our speaker today.
Good afternoon. Pat Garland called me last night about 9 o'clock, said he probably wasn't going to make it, and would I introduce Glenn Spears today. So I said I'd be happy to, it'd be an honor to. And then when Wayne Witter found out that I was going to do this, he called and gave me some coaching, and I'll explain that in a few minutes here. Glenn Spears is our guest speaker. He's a resident of Johns Creek. Currently has a consulting practice helping aerospace and high-tech companies increase market share. But for most of his life, Glenn spent 33 years in the Air Force after graduating from the Air Force Academy as both a pilot and a commander. His last Air Force duty was commander of both 12th Air Force and Air Forces Southern, responsible for 60,000 airmen, 700 combat aircraft, and 23 installations. I thought I was a big deal when I was a 24-year-old captain. I don't tell you. So, during his Air Force career, Glenn piloted 16 different types of aircraft, retired from active duty in 2011 with the rank of Lieutenant General. Lieutenant General is 3 stars. For your Marine Corps guys, that's 3 stars, okay? So that's Witter's coaching. On September 11th, 2001, a day that we all remember quite well, Glenn was commander of the Air Force 89th Airlift Wing and commander of Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. His responsibility included the safe and secure air transport of the President and certain senior executive and legislative branch officials. So please welcome Glenn to tell you about his experience on 9/11. He is a gentleman. He is a good man. He is a true patriot and a great American. Glenn.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Bill. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure for me to join you here at the Atlanta Vietnam Veterans Business Association. I really appreciate Bill giving the introduction. It was just the way my wife wrote it, so thank you very much. Now, a few of you, I'm afraid, have heard my pitch once, some of you twice before. You get extra credit for sitting in on the 3rd time. Kent Sharp is one of those. In fact, I asked Kent if he could give the presentation, and he said he didn't know how to operate the slide forwarding device, so he'll leave it to me. But this is a story about 9/11. It's not a story about me. It's not necessarily a story about our president, but a story about one slice of our Department of Defense and what they were doing on that day, and that slice is the 89th Airlift Wing. But before I get started on that story, I wanted to share another story. I mean, I am a pilot. All I do is tell stories. I wanted to share a story that I heard just at lunch today from one of our members who will remain nameless. And like most of us, he's getting on in years a little bit, has had a wonderful marriage to the same woman now for decades. Beautiful woman. I've met her. I know her. Just the light of his life. They've got children. They've got grandchildren. But he shared somewhat in confidence today that, the spark has kind of gone out. What could I do? And he had been told that, you look at all the television commercials for new automobiles, go buy a new car. That'll bring some spark back to your life. So he thought about it and finally relented to turn in his 1961 Nova. And he bought a Corvette. He bought a convertible Corvette. He's had it about 2 months. It's working like a champ. He loves the car. His wife loves the car. The spark is back. So it was with no hesitation that a week ago, he left his wife the keys to the car. He goes on a business trip, and he misses Snowmageddon. He missed the big snowstorm. Excuse me. But when he came back, takes a taxi home, and his wife meets him at the door. There's no doubt the spark is still there. She's wearing, a nice outfit. She's prepared a wonderful meal. They sit down at dinner. After dinner, they're having a second glass of wine, and she says, "Now, Don Plunkett, Don, have you seen a crumpled $50 bill? And he said, no, not lately. And she reaches into her shirt, pulls out a crumpled $50 bill and hands it to Don. I said, well, this is pretty nice. Don, husband, have you seen a crumpled $100 bill? She reaches someplace a little more private, pulls out a $100 bill. It's all crumpled up, and he said, the spark is back. Finally, she says, Don, have you seen a crumpled $40,000? He said, no. She said, go look in the garage. Well, on a little more serious note, let me tell a story. There I was for our aviators who stood up earlier today, is the way most pilots will start a tale, and there may be some truth to it, there may not, but I assure you most of this is true, because there I was on September 11th. And September 11th in this crowd, September 11th of 2001, is a day where we all share a collective memory. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about that. I'll start with our collective memories and then tell you a bit about my memories of that day. As I said, not so much about me, but the unit that I had the honor to command on September 11th of 2001. So for everyone over the age of about 16 years old, now that we're a number of years on from that fateful day, you will all remember where you were on September 11th. But I said this is a collective memory, so first there will be a group collective memory test. I'll show some images and I'll ask you to tell me what was the date of this image. What's this? Pearl Harbor, of course. December 7th, 1941. A few years later, what is this? August 14th of 45, VJ Day in Times Square. When I give this pitch to high schoolers, of course, they all draw a blank. Who's this young lady? Marilyn. For extra credit, what movie is she filming here? Somewhere at the bottom. 7-Year Itch, actually. 1954. And when is this? 22nd of November of 1963, Dallas, Texas. Some in this room may know this very well. That's right. 1969, the lunar landing. For extra credit, who was number 2 on the moon?
Buzz Aldrin.
Buzz Aldrin. Thank you very much. No one remembers number 2. And where's this? Operation Homecoming. Yes, sir. 54 C-141 missions, including one of your own members, brought back 591 POWs. A little bit later, this is the fall of the Berlin Wall, what many count as the end of the Cold War, 1989. Here in Atlanta, Cassius Clay, otherwise known as Muhammad Ali, 1996, just down the road. And then on September 11th, 2001, unless you were living under a rock, everyone in this room, I bet will remember where you were on that day, and I certainly remember it. I remember it not so much for the terror of that day, but for the response that our nation collectively stood. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. So, as I said, collective memories. I think you all passed the collective memory test. Now let me share a bit about my memories of that day, which actually started about a month before, when General Mike Ryan, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, told me, Glenn, I selected you to command the 89th Airlift Wing just across the river from the Pentagon, the 89th Wing at Andrews Air Force Base. And I asked the chief, thanks very much, it's a great honor, but gee, why did you pick me? I've never flown airlift aircraft before. I've never flown cargo aircraft. I've certainly not moved our senior leaders around the country. He said, Spears, for a very particular purpose, you were exactly the right airman for the job. Of course, I thought it's because I was a good pilot. Maybe I was an adequate commander. He said, no, it's because you're shorter than the president. So, shorter than the president, I was to command the 89th Wing. That's the patch for the wing, experto crede, loosely translated, trust one with experience. It's a wing with a lot of very experienced personnel, a wing that at the time I took command had 45 aircraft of 7 different aircraft types, all commercial derivatives for a very special purpose. To include 2 modified Boeing 747-200s. The official designation is the VC-25. Most people will call it Air Force One. Of course, any aircraft that the president aboard, any Air Force aircraft, the call sign is Air Force One. On a Marine helicopter, that's Marine One, etc. So the wing is best known for those aircraft, but it also operates modified Gulfstreams and even the venerable Huey UH-1 Huey helicopter. A little bit different from what I had grown up in the Air Force flying, B-52s and B-1s, but I figured it's all about delivery. Just depends on what you're carrying and how accurate you need to be. You need to be more accurate delivering bombs than you do with politicians, I found out. So on August 15th, I took command of the wing, about 5,000 airmen in the organization, and dual had it as the installation commander, as Bill mentioned. 3, almost 4 weeks later, I have just said goodbye to the president. You can't see in the picture, but I'm smiling because as Air Force One is taxiing to the runway to depart Andrews Air Force Base and fly to Florida for what I knew to be an overnight trip for the president. He was not scheduled to come back until the next day. I had something else on my mind. In fact, I was receiving my household goods. My wife was at the house, eager for me to help unload boxes just one more time. That was September 10th. And who would know, the next morning, when we woke up, it would be a day much, much different. So on that day, September 11th, at 8 o'clock in the morning, out of Boston's Logan Field, the first 2 of what would become 4 hijacked aircraft launched out of Logan Field, and very soon thereafter are hijacked. These first 2 aircraft were American Flight 11 and United Flight 175, 2 Boeing 767s, scheduled to fly cross-country from Boston to LAX. Meanwhile, out of Dulles and Newark at about the same time, 2 Boeing 757s, again fully fueled for a cross-country flight, take off for the East Coast to go to LAX and San Francisco. And about 45 minutes later, the first aircraft strikes the tower. United Flight 175 strikes, American 11 strikes the tower, doing about 450 miles an hour. Where's President Bush at this time? If you'll remember from the previous slide, he has been aboard Air Force One and went down to Florida for a scheduled meeting at a small school in Florida, an elementary school, where he was to unveil an education policy. He was going to do that after reading a book at the Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida. Triple extra credit. Anybody know the name of the book they were reading? My Pet Goat was the book. And the president, before stepping into that classroom, had been told simply, Mr. President, it's unfolding, but apparently an aircraft has run into a high-rise in New York City. And the president was to write down later, he thought, gee, the weather must be terrible up in New York City. What a terrible accident, for an airplane to run into one of the high-rises. And for those who learned about that first aircraft, myself included, we thought it had to be an accident. Well, the president, as I said, is in this classroom listening to My Pet Goat when now the second aircraft hits the second tower. United Flight 175 now strikes the South Tower doing about 600 miles an hour. And very soon after that, the President's Chief of Staff, Andy Card, a gentleman that I worked with some while I commanded the 89th, interrupted the President, knowing that this was on being videotaped, lots of media in that classroom, whispers to the President, a second plane has hit the second tower. America is under attack. Well, very soon after that, the President excused himself from the classroom, met with Secret Service and other senior leaders who were with him and who are always with him when he travels, gathered the information that he could. Decision was made, obviously, to leave Florida, immediately return to Washington, D.C. They alert the crew of Air Force One, which always has the aircraft prepared for immediate launch after landing and refueling. The President makes a short comment to the media stating that it appears an apparent terrorist attack on our country. He jumps in the motorcade for the 4-mile trip from the school to Sarasota Airport. But as we know now, he did not know then. But as we know now, the attacks and the terror were not over yet. For very soon after that, the third aircraft, American Flight 77, strikes the west side of the Pentagon at about 530 miles an hour. The President arrives at the Sarasota Airport at Air Force One, where Colonel Mark Tillman, who worked for me as the President's pilot and commander of the Presidential Airlift Group, of course, has the aircraft and crew ready for immediate launch as soon as the President is aboard and seated for full power takeoff for what he thought would be a return to Andrews Air Force Base. Meanwhile, back at Andrews Air Patch, where I'm at, we launched many of our 19 assigned Huey helicopters to respond to the Pentagon, from which we could see the smoke, and some would say smell the carnage of those who had been killed there and who were injured at the Pentagon. Note here, first responders and in some cases last rites being given on the grounds just outside the Pentagon. And the fourth aircraft, again, we now know, passengers aboard the fourth aircraft, United Flight 93, who had learned of the other hijackings and had learned of the other aircraft being turned into terrorist weapons, led by Mr. Todd Beamer, overtake their hijackers, and in order to prevent further carnage, they commandeer the aircraft from the hijackers and crash the aircraft into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Todd Beamer is the one, of course, who uttered those now famous words, "Let's roll." And for many years following this incident, at least one combat aircraft in every Air Force wing had nose art painted, "Let's roll," in commemoration of not only Todd Beamer, but all the other passengers aboard that airplane. So, Shanksville, Pennsylvania, the fourth aircraft, an aircraft which the 9/11 Commission determined without a doubt the target for those terrorists was either the White House or the U.S. Capitol. Meanwhile, back aboard Air Force One, the President is in what we call the mobile Oval Office on board the aircraft, meeting and conferring with his leadership there. It may look like, but I was told that they were not praying at that point. One of the uniformed crewmen there is the navigator of Air Force One, and they're talking about alternative locations, because at about this same time, I received a secure call from Mark Tillman, the president's pilot, using the classified designation for the president that he and I only knew, where Mark said, "Boss, we've got the man," that was our call sign for the president, "we've got the man airborne, where do we go?" Good question at that time. Lots of contingency plans. We all know what contingency plans are about. Doesn't matter what service. In the DOD, we're all about contingency plans. We didn't have one for this. Now, I made some recommendations. I know it was not my decision to make. The Secret Service, of course, has responsibility for protecting the president. Theirs was the final decision, but we had recommended that the president land either at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana near Shreveport, or at Offutt Air Force Base outside of Omaha, Nebraska. Both those locations, large Air Force airfields, they're familiar with servicing 747-based aircraft, to include what used to be called the kneecap and other modified Boeing 747. They could provide security, and most important for the president, they could provide him with additional secure communications. He has secure comms aboard Air Force One, even back in 2001 and well before. What he did not have aboard Air Force One, which he wanted and soon thereafter got, was the ability to broadcast to the nation from the aircraft. He knew that the U.S. public wanted to hear from their president. They wanted to know that the president was safe, that National Command Authority was alive and well and still in control, and that they were doing everything they could at that point to protect the nation. But he could not broadcast over standard television or radio signals to broadcast that message. So that's why initially they did land the president at Barksdale Air Force Base. Again, topped off all the tanks of the aircraft, despite the fact that it is in-flight refuelable, and then proceeded to Offutt Air Force Base. As much as the president wanted to return to Washington, D.C., the Secret Service convinced him begrudgingly that it was not yet time to return to Washington, D.C. Again, many thought that there were more attacks coming on our nation's capital, and as I mentioned, with the fourth hijacked aircraft, 9/11 Commission determined that its target was either the White House or the Capitol. Very soon after becoming airborne, the president radios, again via secure call, to the vice president the authority to shoot down any commercial aircraft that were not responding to FAA guidance to immediately land, or to military guidance from military aircraft that were soon airborne. So the president made that shoot down order from Air Force One. And all of you who have been in command, I don't care if it's of a squad of 4 or a significantly larger unit, it is lonely at the top. About this time, the first tower and eventually the second tower, as we all know, collapsed. The president initially, as I said, orbited just outside from Florida over the Gulf of Mexico before flying to Shreveport and then on to Offutt Air Force Base. Meanwhile, our helicopters, in addition to responding to the injured and unfortunately many who had perished in the Pentagon, again only 10 miles across the Potomac River from Andrews Air Force Base, that unit also exercised a classified mission, which I could say only has to do with continuity of government. Where are the presidential successors and protecting them? Well, we knew where the president was, he was safe. We knew where the vice president was, he was safe and in a secure location. Next is Speaker of the House. That's Denny Hastert, who for a period of time was in my command post at Andrews Air Force Base. We're both from Illinois. I thought that was unique that he would spend a little bit of time before we moved him again from Andrews onto a third secure location. President Pro Tem of the Senate at the time was Senator Byrd. He was in a secure location. Fourth, Secretary of State in 2001, that was General Colin Powell. Where was he? He's in Lima, Peru, doing what the Secretary of State does, and we quickly returned him back to the United States aboard another 89th Airlift Wing aircraft. This is what we call the C-32, which is a modified Boeing 757. Eventually, the President was at Offutt Air Force Base. Here he is conducting a secure video teleconference with his National Security Council staff from the command center there at Offutt Air Force Base. He followed that with a media opportunity. Again, this was the second time that he was able to speak to the American public. He did that from Offutt. And finally, as he was chafing at the bit to return to our nation's capital, the Secret Service relented and allowed the President to return. Here you see the aircraft as it approaches Andrews Air Force Base on September 11th, being escorted by an F-16 from the District of Columbia Air National Guard. The D.C. Air National Guard actually flies those F-16s out of Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. As you could imagine, Air Force One flew at maximum speed, about 600 plus miles an hour, nonstop, direct from Offutt to Andrews Air Force Base, again, under the command of Colonel Mark Tillman. I greeted the President upon arrival back at home, back at Andrews Air Force Base. To the best of my knowledge, the only time the 89th Wing Commander ever greeted the Commander-in-Chief wearing a utility uniform, but I don't think the President minded one bit. He had other things on his mind. I can remember as he descended the air stairs, and I greeted him at the foot of the stairs, as I always did when he returned to Andrews, looked me in the eye and said, "Spears, we will find those who have executed this cowardly deed and bring them to justice." And later that evening, as the President addressed the nation from the Oval Office, he said, and I quote, "None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world." And as the President shared later, he wrote in his personal diary that night, "The Pearl Harbor of the 21st century took place today." So we've shared collective memories, my personal memories, not so much about me, but what the 89th Wing was doing in support of the President on a very fateful day back in 2001. What I believe is more important is our response individually and our response as a nation to what we learned on that day. So let me take just a minute to share my thoughts on our response. We came together as a nation. We came together, and for those of all faiths, I think we grew a little closer in faith. Maybe those who up until then had not had faith outside of a foxhole, hopefully you resumed your faith. Our President rallied the nation. And eventually, we got back to work. The President led by example. He got back to work. There were more times for me to escort the President from Marine One to the big airplane, and from the big airplane back to Marine One. I learned how to stay in step with him a little bit better. I never did grow any taller. There were even some opportunities for the first family to take a holiday. Difficult in this image, but there's the first dog. He was always a bit of a problem, especially aboard the aircraft. He always wanted to fly Air Force One. And 1 year after those attacks, the President and the First Lady went to a memorial service. My wife and I, again, escorted the President and the First Lady from Marine One to Air Force One and then back after they returned. But as part of our response, we have built monuments in New York City, at the Pentagon, and in the field outside of Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where as you enter that field, you see the words of Todd Beaver as he encouraged his fellow passengers to let's roll. Hopefully our response included drawing closer to our families, certainly drawing close to our children and those who we love. For that's what it's about, is our response to attacks like those of September 11th, 2001, and not to be terrified by those acts, but to be emboldened to defend freedom and to defend liberty and to ensure that we will always stand up for what's right and defend the United States of America. So with that, my friends, thank you very much. And if there's time, I'm happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Oops, I gotta turn this one. Got it? Right there.
Okay, in honor of your cameraman, I stayed at the podium, which is a very unnatural act for me to do. If we have time, or for those who are interested, I'm happy to take some questions from anyone. And I'll repeat them since the mic won't go around. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us a little bit about transporting the vehicles, the motorcades?
Yeah, transporting the vehicles. Certainly the president, as you all can imagine, he doesn't travel light. And that's not just President Bush, who I had the opportunity to serve while I commanded the 89th Wing, but any modern day president. The mission of transporting the hard car, the podium, the microphones, the additional secure communications, everything that goes with the president, whether it's a domestic flight or more complicated internationally, requires many Air Force airlift aircraft. Used to be flown on C-141s, image of the inside of one I showed earlier. Today, principally aboard C-17 and on occasion C-5 aircraft. That wasn't the responsibility of the 89th Wing. We helped marshal that equipment and often would load it, or almost always would load it out of Andrews Air Force Base. Those airlift aircraft came from other wings within the U.S. Air Force. But even for a 2-day domestic, or in fact a 1-day visit by the president anywhere outside of Washington, D.C., as a minimum will take 3 or 4 C-17 aircraft to move the hard car, the equipment. Oftentimes, particularly if it is an overseas trip, disassemble and pack the Marine helicopters aboard, usually 2 C-17s, get those pre-positioned, reassembled, test flown, and then the Marine helicopters are available to move him where motorcades not feasible. So he does not travel light. No president does. That's regardless of party. Thanks for the question. Yes, sir.
Were you or someone else responsible for the fighter aircraft covering umbrella during that time?
The question is, was I responsible for the fighter aircraft that launched that day? No, again, not part of my command. Day to day, again, I'll preface it with the status on September of 2001. It has changed somewhat since then, as you could imagine. But the defense of North America, the United States and Canada, is the responsibility of North American Aerospace Defense Command, a binational command, U.S. and Canada. And as the Cold War drew down, the number of fighter aircraft based around the periphery of the United States reduced significantly from, let me say, the mid-'80s, kind of height of the Cold War, where we were prepared for and always on the lookout for those Soviet Bear bombers coming over the pole or coming over the GI-UK gap. That threat had decreased. What we were not prepared for on September 11th, 2001 was an attack from inside. So NORAD at that time was responsible for the air defense fighters, interceptor aircraft. They still are today. NORAD has tremendously improved its interaction and cooperation with the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration. Up until September 11th of 2001, the FAA was principally responsible for all the airspace inside our borders, and NORAD looked out. Now there's a much better collaboration of looking both inside and outside. Yes, sir.
Then what were the red flags leading up to this, the increase of these terrorists in the nation? Those private flight schools with flight lessons and all that stuff. Did you share your thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, the question was, what were the red flags before September 11th? Additional people at flight schools interested in learning how to take off, but not necessarily interested in learning how to land aircraft. But looking back on it, that's an obvious red flag. But at the time, they're just, that I know of, and again, not my, I'm not in the FBI or the CIA, but as we have learned as a result of the 9/11 Commission and other open sources, there were indicators. Many of them were missed, or if they were identified, they weren't transmitted from one agency to another. So while there were some indicators that become very easy for us to see looking back, at the time, I think FBI and others would admit that all of us missed it. We unfortunately didn't hire many people whose job it was to think like a terrorist. And so we didn't have that skill set in the nation. Subsequently, I'm told the interaction between those agencies has improved dramatically. I'm sure it could always be improved. Yes, sir.
You made the connection that the reason that President Bush landed in Louisiana and later in Nebraska was to be able to address the nation. Now with that capacity on the planes that would be designated as Air Force One, would the decision have been made to keep the President in the air today?
I think everyone heard, without the ability to broadcast to the American public off of Air Force One, now that that capability exists, would the decision be made to keep the President airborne? That would be my recommendation. Again, up to the Secret Service, it's their responsibility. With the unknown at the time, the chaos and the confusion of those first 2, 3, 6 hours following the attacks, certainly it would have been very easy to keep the aircraft airborne. In fact, nearly for days, because the aircraft is in-flight refuelable. So we could have launched tanker aircraft from anywhere in the U.S., rendezvoused and offloaded fuel to Air Force One and kept the President airborne as long as needed. And he would have been able to satisfy what he thought was part of his many responsibilities on that day, to be able to communicate directly to the U.S. public. And as you highlighted, that capability does exist today only on the VC-25 aircraft, so those two aircraft. On occasion, the President flies on other aircraft that are a little bit smaller. They don't have that same broadcast capability. Way in the back, please.
Were the initial fighter response planes armed?
Question is, were the initial fighter aircraft armed? The answer is yes and no. Some aircraft that were on alert duty under what we now call, and since 9/11 have called Operation Noble Eagle, they were armed. Additional aircraft, as the ones out of Andrews Air Force Base, the DC National Guard, they launched a couple unarmed aircraft because they had pilots and aircraft that were scheduled to go on a training mission, and they launched without weapons. They were on a training mission, so they didn't have live ordnance. a segue to that, and it's a story from the wonderful men and women, in this case, in the U.S. Air National Guard, and their skills and their courage. I'm not personally aware of this, but I've heard this story from a number of sources. I'm confident it's true, despite the fact that it's from an Air Force aviator. At the time, there was an Air Force combat pilot, F-16 pilot, on alert. That pilot's father flew for American Airlines. As the first few attacks unfolded, hour or so later, by this point, pardon me, we know, and that pilot knew, that at least 2 of the hijacked aircraft were American Airlines aircraft on the route that this pilot's father normally flew. I'm sorry, not the hijacked ones that crashed, but this pilot knew that Dad was flying that day on American Airlines. And this pilot launches under the presidential directive to shoot down any non-cooperating commercial aircraft. By non-cooperating, everyone at this point in the skies over the continental United States has been told to land. And if they're not following FAA guidance, the president has authorized shoot down. This pilot, knowing that Dad was flying an American Airlines aircraft, is being vectored to a commercial airliner with an American Airlines call sign that is not responding. This aircraft is transmitting a code, a transponder code, that indicates it has been hijacked. Okay? The 4-digit code that indicates hijacking. This pilot believed that there was a very high probability that they were going to have to shoot down an aircraft, not only with 200 plus innocent civilians aboard, but Dad aboard as well. Now, fortunately, it ended up that aircraft was not hijacked. On occasion, pilots make mistakes. Had inserted the wrong transponder code, and all was well. But the point is, this pilot was prepared to shoot down her father. A female, fully qualified F-16 pilot, knew that Dad was flying that day and almost had to shoot that airplane down. Yes, sir.
There was a offshoot of that 2 aircraft were airborne. I don't know whether they launched quick or just up training. But they somehow or other got a mission. This is on YouTube, which floats around all over the place. That the male leader said, "I'll take the cockpit," and the female wing woman, I guess it was, would take the empennage of 93 that got into Washington. Can you shed any light on that? Is it true?
I don't know if that's true. The question was, 2 fighter aircraft that launched against Flight 93, and between the 2 ships had determined, one would shoot at the front, one would shoot at the tail.
They had no ordnance. They were going to crash.
Oh, they were going to run into it. I have heard that. I don't know personally if that's true. How are we doing on time?
One more question, please. One more.
The helicopters are?
Question is, were the helicopters armed? The Hueys flown by the 89th Wing are not armed. The crew members are, and they are armed and dangerous, but the helicopters are. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you very, very much for coming today. We'd also like to present you with one of our memorable paperweights that displays the Vietnam Service Medal. We have heard that even lieutenant generals who have present this and keep this visible gives you an opportunity to move to a 4-star general before you die.
Thanks very much.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. We really enjoyed it.